They said her child was a mistake, but one human chose to protect them both. The first time I saw her, she wasn't pleading, she wasn't crying, and she wasn't on her knees the way the others had been. She was standing at the edge of the execution platform, wrapped in a tattered fur cloak that clung to her soaked skin like defiance itself, silver hair whipping in the acid wind of the Velquar Highlands, fox-like ears alert and trembling, but her violet eyes locked on mine with a force that nearly made me forget I was the one holding the power here. I was the one wearing the Dominion badge, the one holding the stun hammer that had judged and silenced dozens of others without a second thought. But now that same hand was frozen because this alien woman didn't look at me with fear or even anger but with something infinitely more complicated, something like grief and steel and something I would only much later understand as love in its earliest form, the dangerous kind, the kind that starts with sacrifice and ends in memory. I heard her voice cut through the noise of the watching crowd like it was meant only for me, not pleading, not screaming, but controlled and deliberate. "Punish me, not my son," she said. And I glanced at the child, barely 10 if measured by human years, cradled in her arms like a secret she wasn't ready to give up, his tiny body shivering beneath the damp woven shroud, his skin the same pale glow as hers, his tail curled around her waist protectively even in sleep. For a moment, just a moment, I saw the edge of the veil I'd been trained never to lift, the veil between human and alien, soldier and civilian, law and mercy, and I stepped down from the platform, boots cracking old bones and blood flakes beneath me, and I reached toward her like I was reaching toward a detonator, careful, slow, my breath coiling in the cold air, and said, "What did he do?" She looked at me like I was the one who didn't understand how the world worked, which, in that moment, might have been true, and she whispered, "He breathed." That was when I knew this wasn't an ordinary case. This wasn't a breach of protocol or a border raid or some smuggler caught with forbidden plasma roots. This was something deeper, dirtier, something that had rotted through the bones of this broken planet's justice system, because I recognized her face now, not just from records but from whispers, from underground channels that dared to speak about the treaty bride who had disappeared during the Orvian Rebellion. She had once been promised to a Dominion officer to secure peace, only to vanish the night before the ceremony, taking with her something more valuable than documents or diamonds. She had taken his child, a child that should not exist by either side's laws, a child born of treaty and betrayal, of lust and loyalty, of everything the Empire was too afraid to name. Here she was now, returned like a ghost asking to be chained, asking for punishment not just to protect her son but perhaps also to atone for her own hope. I should have reported it right there. Should have sounded the high priority alert and watched her fall with the others, but instead I reached out and took the child gently from her arms as if to examine him, to verify species code for the record, but the truth is I just wanted to see him, just wanted to feel the weight of a life that had no place here. When she flinched, I saw the scars across her wrist, not old battle scars, but the kind you only get from Dominion shackles, the kind we were taught to ignore. And I felt a life form on my tongue before I even realized I was choosing it. "This child is not on the manifest," I said loud enough for the watchers to hear. "This child was never here." I looked at the guards, 2 brutes in black mesh armor, already tense, hands on their sidearms, and I added, "And this woman is not guilty of any capital crime." Silence fell across the execution ring like frostbite, slow and suffocating, but I kept my voice steady. "She will be processed through medical quarantine for transport reassignment, which was code for she disappears and nobody asks how or why." I turned, child in my arms, and she sat in the corner of the medbay like a ghost unsure if she had truly returned to life, watching me with those eyes that never quite rested. The boy curled beside her in sleep as the ship hummed around us in its slow crawl through the lesser orbits of Velquar. And I didn't know whether I was the rescuer or the accomplice or just another fool tangled in something far more dangerous than anyone had warned me about. But when I looked at her sitting there barefoot with a dim blue light stroking the soft contours of her cheek, something inside me tightened like a wire pulled too far, not from duty or guilt or sympathy but from the aching way her body curled protectively around her child, and I found myself lingering by the doorway longer than I should have, pretending to check system readouts that didn't need checking. Sensors that didn't need monitoring, but it was easier than facing what I had already begun to feel, and when she spoke again, her voice was quieter now, almost raw, like she wasn't sure how to use it after so many years of silence. She asked, "What happens next?" And I told her the truth because I couldn't lie to her face, not with the way her hair shimmered even in this dying light, not with the way her collarbone lifted when she breathed like her whole body had to work harder for every second of peace. And I said, "I don't know, but you're not going back to the surface, not while I'm still breathing." And I expected resistance or disbelief or some bitter joke, but instead she stood slowly and moved toward me, every step deliberate like she had learned long ago that the wrong movement could be mistaken for rebellion. And when she reached me she placed one hand flat against my chest as if to measure the sincerity of my heartbeat and asked, "Why are you doing this?" And I should have said something noble or practical, some clever deflection to hide what was already cracking through the edges of my discipline, but all I said was, "I couldn't watch you break." And that's when her hand moved, slowly, fingers tracing the seam of my uniform, pausing at the clasp near my shoulder like she was asking a question not with words but with touch. And I didn't stop her because my body had already betrayed my orders, already moved too far past the line drawn by every protocol I once followed without question. And I didn't speak because my throat was full of her scent, of snow, and blood and starlight. And when her lips met mine it wasn't desperate or wild, it was soft and terrifying and full of something I had forgotten could exist between enemies. Something tender and electric and impossibly fragile, like kissing the moment before the first drop of rain in a storm. And she pulled back just enough to say, "If I give you this part of me, will it be used against me later?" And I didn't answer with words, I just touched her cheek, traced the edge of her jaw with the back of my knuckle, and watched the way her eyes fluttered shut not in surrender but in something more complicated, a kind of cautious hope, the kind that comes after years of being hunted and marked and left behind. And when her cloak slipped from her shoulders I saw the old scars that ran along her back, shallow and silvery like remnants of forgotten violence, and I reached out, not to possess her, but to witness her, to remember that this was real and not some illusion spun by guilt or loneliness. And she let me, her fingers undoing the rest of the closures between us with the same quiet defiance she'd shown on the platform, the same grace that made her not a prisoner but a storm disguised in a woman's body. And when our skin finally met, there was no rush, no frenzied collapse into lust, but a slow unraveling, the kind of intimacy built not from hunger but from the terrifying vulnerability of being seen, really seen. And as we moved together on the sterile floor of the medbay, surrounded by machines still humming quietly in oblivion, I felt something shatter inside me, not pain but a surrender I had never allowed myself to feel, a letting go of every rule, every caution. I don't know what woke me first, whether it was the subtle shift in engine hum or the sudden way Lyra's body stiffened in my arms, but in an instant the warmth we'd shared was replaced by tension so sharp it felt like the ship itself had exhaled in warning. And before I could ask she was already on her feet, grabbing the shredded cloak and throwing it around her shoulders while her eyes darted to the ceiling vents like a hunted animal sensing the presence of something it couldn't yet see but already feared. And I pulled my suit back on with shaking fingers as the proximity sensor on the wall pulsed red once, then again, slow but steady, not an alarm but a heartbeat. And Lyra whispered without looking at me, "They found us." And I knew without asking who she meant because there was only one force in the Dominion that could penetrate this deep into Velkor's blind zones without triggering surveillance, the Shadow Binders, off-the-record enforcers used to erase diplomatic errors without the mess of trials or witness reports. And if they were here then someone had marked me, not just as a dissenter but as a traitor, which meant I had underestimated how fast the system could close its fist once it noticed something slipping through its fingers. And Lyra was already at the child's side, lifting him gently, wrapping him tighter in the cloth while her tail looped instinctively around his small frame. And I could hear her breath now, shallow and fast, not from panic but from muscle memory of what came next, because she had run before, had hidden, had watched people she trusted disappear in the name of peace. And I reached for the emergency compartment behind the medbench and pulled out the stealth suit and handheld field displacer, tossing her the former and activating the latter. And as the ship dimmed and the false echo layer activated, I kissed her quickly, firmly, on the mouth, because I didn't know if we would get another chance, and said, "Cargo hold, lower shaft, crawl tunnel exit." And she nodded without hesitation, already moving, already adjusting the suit as she vanished through the rear corridor while I remained behind, pulling my Dominion ID over my neck and slipping the badge onto my shoulder like a man preparing for his own funeral, and the knock came exactly 15 seconds later, not loud, not even aggressive, but clinical, and when I opened the inner airlock door, the two agents that stepped in were exactly what I feared, one tall and quiet, with a face like carved marble and eyes that didn't blink, the other shorter with cybernetic enhancements tracing his jaw and fingers like ornamental filigree, and neither smiled, neither spoke at first. They just scanned the room with a kind of slow meticulous presence that made everything inside me ache with a desire to shoot first, but I kept my hands low, fingers near the emergency trigger on my left vambrace, and finally the tall one spoke, "Authorization scan, now," and I held out my wrist, letting him read the fake log I'd spent 6 hours crafting during our orbital drift, and while he scanned I casually walked toward the medbench, placing myself between them and the route Lyra had taken. And the short one narrowed his eyes as he circled, sniffing the air like a predator catching the hint of prey, and he said, "You've been entertaining something unauthorized, Commander," and I shrugged with practiced indifference, trying to keep my heartbeat steady, trying not to look at the corner where the cloak had fallen, and replied, "Just memories, some of us are still human enough to miss things," and he didn't laugh but he did step closer, his fingers twitching with that precise rhythm I'd seen only in hunters trained for silent takedowns, and then he asked, "Where's the hybrid?" And it wasn't a question, not really, it was the tightening of the noose, the opening of the final chapter, and I turned, slow, deliberate, meeting both their eyes and saying, "You're mistaken, I haven't seen her in years," and it might have worked if the child hadn't made a sound, not a cry, not even a whimper, Jews. The thing about hiding in a half-collapsed terradome in the middle of a frozen no-man's land is that nothing ever goes according to plan, assuming we even had a plan to begin with, which we didn't, unless you count don't get caught as a plan, in which case we were already behind schedule, and as I stood in the center of the shattered atrium with snow slowly seeping through cracks in the ceiling and Lyra glaring at me while trying to light a salvaged heating coil with a plasma spark that sputtered like a dying mosquito, I realized I had officially lost control of everything, including my own mouth, which chose that exact moment to say something incredibly unhelpful like, "It could be worse," to which she responded without looking up, "Oh really, how?" And I immediately regretted opening my mouth, because she had that look, the one that said she'd been through too much to pretend things were fine, and the heating coil chose that moment to explode in a puff of smoke, singeing her hair slightly and making Kale burst into a half-laugh, half-cough fit, and I knelt to help her but she slapped my hand away, muttering something in her language that I'm fairly certain translated to something like clumsy male or possibly walking disaster, and I sat back, lifting my hands in surrender, saying, okay, I'll fix the heat," and she snorted but didn't argue, instead curling up next to Kale, wrapping her tail around both of them like a living blanket while I dug through a crate of outdated Dominion supplies that looked like they hadn't been touched since the last ice age, and I found a thermal core unit wrapped in old rations, and it sparked weakly when I slapped it against the wall a few times, and I grinned like a madman and whispered, "Never doubt my dumb luck," and when I brought it over and it started humming gently with actual warmth she looked at me like I had conjured fire with my bare hands, which I admit made my chest swell just a little, until she said, "You're still bleeding," and I looked down to realize the makeshift bandage on my side had soaked through with red and was sticking to my shirt in a way that made removal feel like peeling off half my skin, and I winced and said, "It adds character," and she rolled her eyes before pointing to the bench, "Sit," and I obeyed because something in her voice made it impossible not to, and she knelt in front of me with a precision that made me suddenly very aware of her proximity, of her hands moving under my shirt, of her fingers pressing gently against my ribs while her breath tickled my skin, and I may have stopped breathing entirely for a few seconds because she glanced up and smirked, "You're blushing," and I muttered something about the cold but she wasn't buying it, and I closed my eyes and focused very hard on not thinking about the fact that she was now cleaning the wound with a strip of cloth soaked in something that smelled like mint and ozone, and I asked, "What is that?" and she replied, "Nothing, you want to drink?" And the pain hit a second later like a slap made of electricity and I yelped and she said, "Hush, or you'll wake Kale," and I bit my tongue so hard I nearly drew more blood, and then she blew gently on the cleaned wound and something in my brain melted a little, and she noticed because her voice dropped slightly and she said, You're not used to being taken care of, are you? And I opened my eyes and looked at her and said, no, not really, and she nodded slowly, then leaned up and pressed a kiss just above the bandage, soft and unexpected and so tender it made something behind my eyes sting, and she whispered, thank you, and I didn't ask for what because I already knew, and we sat there for a while in that fragile peace, listening to the wind claw at the walls and the heat core hum like a lullaby, and Cale stirred in his sleep, murmuring her name like it was the only word he trusted, and she looked over at him with a softness that made me feel like I was intruding, even though I wasn't going anywhere, and I cleared my throat and said, we're going to need a new plan, and the moment her lips met mine again, it felt different. Not rushed or desperate like a goodbye, but slower, fuller, like she was learning me through touch rather than words. I responded with the same reverence, because we both understood this wasn't just about survival or stolen pleasure in the shadow of fear. This was about choosing each other in defiance of a galaxy that had already marked us for erasure. As her fingers slid up beneath the edge of my shirt, I didn't flinch or pull away. I leaned into her warmth and let the sensation ripple through me, like the first breath after being underwater too long. When I gently lifted the ragged fur cloak from her shoulders, she stepped out of it without hesitation, letting it fall into the frost with a softness that felt like a promise. Her eyes didn't waver as I traced the line of her collarbone with my fingers, memorizing the texture of her skin, the subtle glow beneath its surface like a quiet constellation hidden in her body. I whispered her name once, not to ask anything of her but just to say it out loud. She smiled against my throat, her breath warm as her hands moved over me, pulling me closer with a need that was not rushed but deep, like gravity, like something she had waited too long to allow. When she guided me down onto the old thermal blanket beside the humming heat core, the cold world outside disappeared, and all that remained was the rhythm of skin meeting skin and breath mingling with breath. Her thighs wrapped around me with a strength that startled me, not violent but insistent, like she wasn't afraid to take what she wanted but was afraid to let it slip away again. I met her kiss with equal force, letting my hands explore the curves and scars of her body, the way her back arched as I touched the delicate fur along her hips, the subtle twitch of her ears as I grazed her neck. Every reaction she gave me was a gift, raw and unfiltered and real. When she pressed her forehead to mine and whispered something in her native tongue, it didn't matter that I didn't understand the words, because the emotion poured through every syllable, thick with longing and trust and a quiet kind of pain that asked me silently to stay. I answered, not with words, but with how I held her, how I moved with her, how I kissed her until she melted into me, and we became something not easily described. Not just man and alien, or protector and fugitive, but something ancient and instinctual, a kind of union forged not by law or ritual, but by the shared ache of being alone too long. When I entered her, it was with a slowness that bordered on reverent. The heat between us blooming into something deeper, something that hummed in my chest like the old songs my mother used to play when the world still felt kind. She gasped, not in pain, but in release, her legs tightening around me as our rhythm found itself in waves, slow and building, each thrust as soft defiance against the cold and the dark and the memories that had chased us for too long. When her hands gripped my shoulders and she pulled me deeper, I let myself go fully, no longer thinking, no longer calculating, just feeling her. The rise and fall of her body against mine, the way she whispered my name now in my language with a tenderness that broke something open in me, and the way she looked at me then, like she saw every flaw, every scar, and chose to keep holding me anyway, was more intimate than anything our bodies could do. As we moved together, the tension in my spine unraveled, and the world around us melted into warmth and rhythm and heat. When she climaxed, her mouth parted in a silent cry, her body trembling against mine, and I followed seconds later, shuddering with a release that left me breathless and blinking, as if the stars had just moved inside me. We lay tangled together, skin to skin, heartbeats slowly sinking in the fading glow of shared bliss. I brushed her damp hair from her cheek and kissed the corner of her mouth, tasting her joy and exhaustion. She exhaled against my chest, one hand splayed across my ribs as if. We left the Terradome just before dawn, our breath still fogging in the bitter air as the last of the heat core sputtered behind us, and though our bodies ached and our supplies were laughable, there was a strange clarity in the way we moved, side by side, Kale bundled against my chest and Lyra scanning the horizon with those sharp eyes that never stopped searching for exits even when there was nothing but white stretching in every direction, and I told myself we would find a signal blind spot. A crater bunker, a buried relay outpost, anything that could buy us more time, but I hadn't expected to see the ship waiting there beyond the ridge, sleek and black and too clean for this wasteland, its surface humming with silent power and its ramp lowered like an open invitation or a trap dressed in good intentions, and Lyra stopped cold as soon as she saw it, grabbing my arm and pulling me down behind a snowdrift, her whisper fierce and breathless as she said, "That's a Zovaran stealth carrier. Dominion issue, private clearance, not military but not civilian either," and I asked how she knew and she said because I've been on one just like it before I disappeared. And the way she said it made my stomach tighten because I suddenly remembered something she told me in fragments, back when we were first hiding, about the man she was once promised to, a high-ranking Dominion ambassador named Darien Voss who vanished from the records after she ran, a man whose obsession with a treaty child had nearly started a silent purge of hybrid-borns across 3-star sectors, and I looked back at the ship and felt the sinking weight of dread settle into my chest because I had heard that name before, not in reports or whispers, but because it was my brother's, and my mind spun fast and vicious as pieces clicked together in places I didn't want them to, and I asked her slowly, carefully, did he have a scar just under his left eye, and she froze, her pupils narrowing as she said yes. Why? And I stared at the ship and whispered, because I do too, and it runs in the family, and she blinked at me like I had slapped her and said, "You're lying," but I wasn't, and I told her the truth that my name wasn't just Eli. It was Elias Voss, second son of the Voss line, the one they kept off the public ledger, the one trained for logistics and off-world diplomacy but who walked away when I realized the cost of loyalty, and I watched as the storm behind her eyes cracked open and she backed away from me, holding Kale tighter and saying, "No, no, you can't be one of them," but I reached for her and said I didn't know it was you, I didn't know Kale was mine. And the words tumbled out before I could stop them because suddenly it all made sense, the way I felt drawn to her the moment I saw her on the platform, the way Kale's eyes had felt familiar even in sleep, the way I had been willing to risk everything for them without fully understanding why, and she stared at me with a fury I didn't know she had, her voice shaking as she said, "You think this is some kind of reunion, some noble family drama? Do you think this makes it better, that you're his uncle, that you're blood?" And I shook my head saying, "It's not about that, it's about the choice I made before I knew, the choice to protect you because I saw what they were doing to you." And she hissed, "And what if it wasn't me? Would you have looked away?" And I wanted to say no but I didn't have the right to answer that, so I said, "I'm not him, I'm not Darien." And she said, "But you're a Voss," and I looked at her and said, "Not anymore." And she stared at me for a long moment that felt like it stretched across the entire frozen field, and finally she said quietly, "Then prove it." And I nodded once and stood, walking out from behind the drift into open ground with my arms raised and my badge thrown into the snow, and the ship reacted instantly, side turrets shifting slightly but not firing as the ramp extended fully and a figure stepped down onto the ice, tall and clean-cut in a suit that glowed faintly at the seams, his FAC. The strange thing about surviving a cosmic energy pulse, caused by a glowing child who may or may not be the evolutionary answer to 3,000 years of interspecies tension, is that no one really prepares you for the awkward morning after. As I sat on a half-melted crate outside the collapsed Terra Dome, watching Lyra try to convince Kale to eat something that didn't come in the form of a glowing crystal or a frozen ration bar, I found myself realizing that even now, even after the world had nearly shattered around us, some things stayed hilariously the same. Like a mother nagging her child, and a man pretending he wasn't bleeding from 3 different places because he didn't want to look uncool. Kale had apparently decided that, since he had briefly hovered above the ground and made soldiers collapse by blinking too hard, he was now above nutrition entirely, and kept muttering that he wasn't hungry and that food was for normal kids, which made Lyra sigh in a way that somehow sounded like both exasperation and affection. When she finally tossed him the protein square and told him to eat it before she stuffed it down his throat herself, I had to look away because I was laughing so hard I nearly choked. Lyra gave me a look that said she hadn't yet decided whether I was still on her list of people she trusted or people she'd leave behind in the next snowstorm. To be fair, I didn't blame her, because things were complicated. And by complicated, I mean I had accidentally become emotionally entangled with a woman who had once been promised to my psychotic older brother, and was now the mother of a child who could literally break the laws of physics with his feelings. Yet, despite all that, the weirdest thing was that I didn't want to be anywhere else. That scared me more than anything the Dominion could send after us, because wanting something that badly meant you had something to lose, and the moment you had something to lose, the galaxy smelled it like blood and began to circle. Lyra sat beside me on the crate, wrapped in a patched cloak that didn't match any of the colors around us, her white hair pulled back into a knot that was trying very hard to pretend it wasn't coming undone, and said, "You should rest." I replied, "I'm fine," and she reached out and poked the bruise forming under my left eye and said, "You're full of crap." I winced and said, gently, and she grinned, which was a rare and beautiful thing, and added, "You're lucky I'm too tired to kick your ass properly." I nodded solemnly and said, "Noted for later." Kale chose that exact moment to inform us that he had to pee, but he didn't want to go alone because last time he peed in the snow, it had hissed at him. Lyra groaned and said, "That's steam, not snow snakes," and I blinked and said, "I'm sorry, snow snakes." She looked at me like I was the idiot in this conversation and explained that on Zarathea there are creatures that mimic snowbanks to trap prey. I raised both eyebrows and said, "And you were planning on telling me this when?" She replied, "After we finished kissing the last time, but you were kind of busy." I stared at her, trying very hard not to imagine what might have happened if I had stepped off the path to take a leak alone in the dark. Kale announced that he was going to go behind the wrecked shuttle and not to listen if he started singing, and then proceeded to do exactly that, with the pitch and tone of a malfunctioning alarm. We sat there in the silence that followed his off-key performance, and Lyra said softly, "He doesn't know how to control it yet." I nodded, because that much was obvious, and said, "What happens if he loses control again?" She looked at me and said, "I don't know." And that right there was the scariest sentence I had heard since this all started, because if there was one thing Lyra always had, it was answers, even if they were painful. But now there was uncertainty, and that meant danger. I asked if she thought the Dominion would try to capture him, and she laughed without humor and said, "They'll try to harvest H." We reached the gorge just as the light began to shift, not quite sunset, not quite moonrise, but that quiet in-between glow where everything seemed softer and more honest, and as we descended into the narrow canyon floor with Kale leading the way by chasing some imaginary trail only he could see and Lyra walking beside me in silence, I found myself thinking that maybe we weren't running anymore, not the way we used to, not like prey darting through cracks, but more like people moving forward. One uneven step at a time, and when we found the shelter built into the canyon wall, half hidden behind ancient root systems and petrified stone, I laughed because I remembered it as a ridiculous side project, a survival pod left over from an old mapping expedition, something we never finished or registered, a place we joked would be our hideout if the galaxy ever turned on us, and here it was, buried under time and frost, but still there, still waiting, and Lyra gave me a look that said you're either the luckiest man alive or the most annoying kind of genius, and I said, "Why not both?" And she rolled her eyes and kissed my cheek and said, "Go fix the door before your lucky charm wears off," and I did, using a broken panel from Kale's satchel as a makeshift battery conduit while he stood beside me holding up Blord like it was a sacred artifact and declaring that only true warriors could enter, and I told him that made me an honorary warrior and he said, "No, you're just a guy who fixes things and makes mom smile," and I blinked and smiled and said, "That's enough for me," and it was. And when the door finally opened with a slow metallic sigh, revealing the dark interior lined with old blankets, sealed food packs, and a solar generator that somehow still blinked to life after all these years, Lyra stepped inside and whispered, "This is the first place that feels like it could be ours," and I watched her as she took Kale's hand and led him toward the sleeping area and I said, "It is ours now," and for the first time, she didn't argue, and the next few days passed like some quiet dream, filled with small routines and warm meals and the kind of laughter that starts tentative and becomes natural again, and we set up solar panels during the day and told stories at night, and Kale found a stash of old data pads and began reading everything from ancient myths to ship schematics, and he would ask questions with that sharp, fearless curiosity of his, and sometimes we answered, and sometimes we just said, not yet, and he always nodded like he understood, even if he didn't, and Lyra started drawing again, little sketches on cracked screens and scraps of fabric, and I would catch her sometimes, staring at Cale with a look in her eyes that was part joy and part terror, like she still couldn't believe he existed, and I'd wrap my arms around her and say, "We're safe," and she'd whisper, "For now," and I knew that was true, but I also knew something had changed since the gorge, not in Cale, but in us, because we no longer spoke in ifs, we spoke in when. And one evening as the sky turned a brilliant copper and Cale slept under a pile of furs clutching Blord like it was a holy relic, Lyra and I sat on the edge of the shelter, our legs dangling into the wind, and she said, "Do you think it will always feel like we're waiting for the next chase?" And I said, "Maybe, but we're not alone anymore," and she leaned into me and said, "No, we're not," and we watched the stars come out. One by one, tiny lights in an endless black ocean. And for the first time since I'd pulled her off that execution platform, I let myself believe we might actually get to build something instead of just survive it. And the next morning brought something I never expected, a message, not through the main line, not from the Dominion, but a short-range beacon broadcast embedded in an old encryption key only a few people knew, and I stared at it on the screen for a long time before Lyra came over and touched my shoulder and said, "Is it them?" And I shook my head and said, "No. It's someone else, someone Lee."